In the spring of 2008, in a small Florida town wrapped in palm trees and swamplands, a young woman's sudden disappearance became the kind of story that everyone whispered about but no one could explain. For years it was treated like an urban legend, a ghost story used to warn children not to walk alone at night. But behind the rumors was a real family, a grieving mother, a devastated community, and a mystery that would stay cold for nearly 2 decades. And now, 17 years later, police have finally made an arrest. But here's the chilling part: the man they took into custody wasn't some shadowy stranger. He was someone who had been there the entire time. Backhand index pointing right. Before I take you into this case, stop right now, hit that subscribe button, and turn on all notifications. I tell stories exactly like this, real, terrifying, mysterious, every single time. You do not want to miss what happens in this one. The last night anyone saw her alive. Her name was Marissa Taylor. She was 22 years old, ambitious, bright, and the kind of person who lit up a room when she walked in. She lived with her mom in a quiet cul-de-sac not far from the Everglades, and on the night everything went wrong, she had just finished her late shift at a family-owned diner off Highway 41. It was May 14, 2008, a Wednesday. The kind of night where the Florida humidity clung heavy in the air, cicadas screamed in the trees, and the roads were so dark you could barely see 2 feet in front of you. At around 11:45 p.m., Marissa left the diner, waved to her coworkers, and got into her car, a faded silver Toyota Camry. She told her manager she was exhausted but planned to drive straight home. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. The abandoned car. The next morning, commuters spotted something strange on a rural road near a canal, a car with its driver's side door wide open. Police arrived quickly and confirmed it was Marissa's Toyota. What they found inside made their blood run cold. Her purse was on the passenger seat. Her keys were still in the ignition. And faint streaks of blood stained the steering wheel. Just a few feet away, half buried in mud, was one of her sneakers. But Marissa herself? She was gone. At first, police thought maybe she had stumbled into the swamp in the dark and gotten lost. But when dogs were brought in, they tracked her scent only a short distance before it vanished completely. It was as if she had been plucked off the earth. The investigation stalls. Detectives question everyone: coworkers, friends, neighbors, and ex-boyfriends. They searched the canal with divers. They scoured nearby motels, bus stops, and truck depots. But nothing concrete surfaced. It didn't make sense. Marissa wasn't the type to run away. She had no enemies. No secret double life. And yet, the evidence suggested foul play. Theories swirled. Some believed she'd been targeted by a transient drifter. Others swore it had to be someone local, someone who knew those backroads well enough to hide a body in the swamp. But despite their efforts, investigators hit a wall. Leads dried up. Evidence went missing. And slowly, heartbreakingly, the case was pushed into the cold files. Her mother never stopped searching. Every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, she left a candle burning in the front window, praying her daughter would come home. The whisper about a suspect. Even back in 2008, there had been whispers about a man who lived just a few streets away. He was friendly enough, often helping neighbors with yard work, fixing cars, or lending tools. Outwardly, he seemed harmless. But there was something unsettling about him. Something in his stare that lingered too long. Police had questioned him briefly at the time, but with no physical evidence linking him to Marissa, they couldn't make an arrest. And so, for 17 years, he blended in, living his life, attending community events, and watching as Marissa's family withered under the weight of unanswered questions. The breakthrough. Then, in early 2025, something extraordinary happened. Advances in forensic technology allowed investigators to revisit the case with fresh eyes. Evidence that had once been inconclusive was re-examined with brand new DNA testing techniques. And what they discovered changed everything. Backhand index pointing right. If you think old cases like this can't be solved, you're wrong. That's why it's so important to share these stories. Hit that like button right now, Because the more attention these cases get, the more pressure is put on investigators to keep digging. 17 years later, an arrest. Authorities quietly built their case for months, gathering enough proof to finally move in. And then, in the dead of night, they made their move. The man believed to have been hiding in plain sight for nearly 2 decades was led away in handcuffs. Neighbors were stunned. They'd eaten at his table, waved to him on their morning walks, and trusted him around their children. But behind the mask of a helpful neighbor was something far darker. And when police announced his arrest, they revealed something that sent chills across Florida. This wasn't just about Marissa. There may have been others. Backhand index pointing right, stick with me, because we're going to break down the shocking evidence that finally cracked this case, and what police found inside the suspect's home that left even seasoned investigators horrified. The break in the case. For nearly 17 years, the disappearance of Marissa Taylor haunted both her family and the small Florida town she had called home. People whispered theories, but deep down, most believed the case would never be solved. Until 2025. Because that year, a new detective named Rachel Morales joined the county's cold case unit. She was younger than most of the others, relentless, and known for her obsession with detail. Where other detectives saw closed doors, Rachel saw cracks, and she was determined to push them wide open. Re-examining the evidence. Rachel began by pulling Marissa's file. Thousands of pages of interviews, reports, photographs, and lab notes had accumulated over the years. But what stood out immediately were the small items collected from Marissa's abandoned car back in 2008. The blood on the steering wheel. The sneaker found in the mud. A single strand of hair tangled in the seatbelt. Back then, DNA analysis wasn't what it is today. The blood and hair had been tested, but the results were inconclusive, degraded. The case went cold because science simply wasn't ready. But in 2025, things were different. Rachel sent the evidence back through modern DNA analysis, more advanced, more sensitive. And this time, the results didn't just tell a story. They pointed to a name. The suspect emerges. When the test results came back, Rachel felt her stomach drop. The DNA belonged to Thomas Rayburn, the very same man locals had whispered about years ago. Back in 2008, Thomas was 32, single, and known as the quiet, helpful neighbor. He fixed fences, mowed lawns, and always seemed available to lend a hand. Outwardly, he looked like the kind of guy you wanted in your community. But there had always been something a little off about him. Now, with DNA placing him inside Marissa's car, the whispers were no longer rumors. They were proof. But Rachel wasn't satisfied. She wanted more. Building the case. For months, Rachel and her team quietly surveilled Thomas, watching his every move. He had aged since 2008, now in his late 40s, balding, heavyset. To anyone else, he was just another middle-aged man living a quiet life. But Rachel noticed his habits, the way he avoided eye contact, how he seemed to scan parking lots nervously before getting into his car, and how he always double-checked the locks on his doors. He was hiding something. Investigators dug into his past, old jobs, relationships, places he had lived. What they found was disturbing. In nearly every town Thomas had lived, there had been reports of young women harassed, followed, or disappearing under mysterious circumstances. None of those cases were ever solved. Backhand index pointing right, quick pause. If you're the kind of person who believes cold cases deserve attention, hit that subscribe button right now. Stories like Marissa's matter, and bringing them back into the light is how justice finally gets served. The arrest. In the dead of night, after gathering enough evidence, law enforcement made their move. A convoy of unmarked cars pulled quietly into Thomas's neighborhood. Neighbors peeked out their windows, watching as officers surrounded his modest, one-story home. At 2:13 a.m., Thomas Rayburn was taken from his house in handcuffs. For the first time in 17 years, Marissa's mother received the call she had been waiting for. The words were simple but life-changing. "We've made an arrest in your daughter's case." She broke down in tears. But what investigators uncovered inside Thomas's home would take this case from tragic to absolutely horrifying. The House of Secrets. Inside Thomas's small brick house, detectives expected to find maybe a few clues linking him to Marissa. What they found instead was a nightmare. In a locked storage room in the basement, police discovered dozens of old boxes filled with women's belongings, jewelry, purses, clothing, even shoes. Each item was carefully labeled with dates. Some of those dates stretched back years before Marissa disappeared. On one shelf sat a weathered photo album. But inside, instead of family pictures, were snapshots of women, some smiling, some unaware they were being photographed. And tucked in the back of the album, there was a picture of Marissa, taken just days before she vanished. It was proof that Thomas had been watching her, stalking her, and maybe stalking others too. The horrifying implication. Investigators realized that if these items belonged to more than one victim, then Thomas wasn't just responsible for Marissa's disappearance. He might have been a serial predator. And now, every unsolved missing person case in the surrounding counties was being re-examined. Backhand index pointing right, and this is where things get darker, because in Act 3, we're going to dive into the shocking discoveries that turn this from a single arrest into a possible multi-victim investigation. And trust me, what investigators uncovered in his backyard left even seasoned detectives speechless. The backyard secrets. When police took Thomas Rayburn into custody, the town breathed a sigh of relief. For 17 years, they had lived with the shadow of Marissa Taylor's disappearance. Now, with DNA evidence pointing directly at Thomas, justice seemed within reach. But what no one knew was that this arrest wasn't the end of the nightmare. It was only the beginning. The search of the house. The morning after Thomas was arrested, investigators descended on his small brick home with search warrants in hand. From the outside, the house looked ordinary: a sagging porch, faded shutters, a rusty swing set in the backyard. But inside, detectives found something closer to a tomb of secrets. The basement room with the labeled boxes had already raised alarms. Jewelry, shoes, purses, women's belongings that clearly didn't belong to Thomas. The eerie photo album. But then, in a locked cabinet, they found something far more chilling: a collection of videotapes. Each one dated. Each one with a woman's name scrawled on the side in permanent marker. Authorities have never released the full details of what was on those tapes. But according to one investigator, the footage was beyond disturbing. It was enough to confirm what many feared: Marissa was not his only victim. The backyard dig. After the tapes were discovered, cadaver dogs were brought in to search the property. Almost immediately, they alerted to a spot in the backyard beneath the old swing set. Neighbors stood in silence as investigators erected floodlights and began digging. Hours passed. Then, just after midnight, shovels hit something solid. Wrapped in layers of tarp and plastic were bones. Human bones. The excavation went on for 2 days. By the end, detectives had recovered the partial remains of at least 2 different women. The horrifying implication was undeniable: Thomas hadn't just killed Marissa. He had been hiding bodies in plain sight, literally, in his own backyard, while hosting barbecues and waving at neighbors as their children played a few feet above his victims. Backhand index pointing right. Before we go further, take a second, hit that like button. Stories like this show us why cold cases must stay alive. This case sat in silence for 17 years, but DNA, persistence, and attention finally cracked it. That matters. The town reacts. News spread like wildfire. The front page of the local paper ran the headline: "Bodies found in suspect's backyard, cold case now a serial murder investigation." For residents who had once defended Thomas, it was unthinkable. "I never would have guessed," one neighbor said, shaking her head. "He helped me fix my car last year. I let my kids play in that backyard." But for others, the news didn't come as a shock. They'd always felt something unsettling about him: the way he watched women walk down the street, the way he lingered too long at the diner, or how he always seemed to know too much about local girls. Now, Those uneasy feelings felt like missed warnings. The mother's anguish. For Marissa's mother, the discovery was both devastating and strangely comforting. Devastating because it confirmed her daughter had been murdered. But comforting because after nearly 2 decades of not knowing, she finally had answers. At a press conference, her voice broke as she said, "I always believed my daughter was still out there, but now I know she's finally at peace. And I know who took her from me." Her words silenced the room. The chilling pattern. As investigators sifted through the evidence in Thomas's home, a disturbing pattern emerged. The boxes of belongings. The labeled tapes. The bones in the backyard. This wasn't random. This was organized. Calculated. It suggested Thomas had been doing this for years, possibly even before Marissa disappeared. Detectives began reaching out to nearby counties, pulling old missing person reports, looking for similarities. Soon, connections began to form. Women who had vanished between 2004 and 2010, all young, all living within 50 miles of Thomas. Suddenly, what began as a single cold case was unraveling into the horrifying possibility that Thomas Rayburn could be one of Florida's most prolific, undiscovered serial killers. Backhand index pointing right, and it's only going to get darker. Investigators uncover something inside Thomas's journals that doesn't just confirm their fears, it exposes his twisted motive, and it's worse than anyone could have imagined. Inside the mind of a predator. The discovery of human remains in Thomas Rayburn's backyard sent shockwaves through Florida. For 17 years, people believed the disappearance of Marissa Taylor was a tragic but isolated case. Now, that illusion had been ripped away. This wasn't just a missing persons case. This was the work of a predator who had been living undetected in their midst. And investigators were about to learn just how twisted Thomas really was. The journals. During the search of his home, detectives uncovered a locked chest buried beneath boxes in the attic. Inside were several spiral-bound notebooks, their covers stained and worn with age. When investigators opened the first one, they were stunned. Page after page contained meticulous, handwritten entries. Some were daily observations, where Thomas went, who he spoke to. But others were far more disturbing. They were written like hunting logs. Each entry described women in chilling detail. What they wore. Where they worked. When they were most vulnerable. And then there were the entries marked with stars. Those weren't just observations. Those were plans. Marissa's name appeared multiple times in those starred sections. In one entry dated a week before her disappearance, Thomas wrote, "Saw her leaving work late again. Nobody walks her out. Perfect opportunity soon." The obsession. The deeper investigators dug into the journals, the clearer the picture became. Thomas wasn't impulsive. He wasn't random. He was calculating. He treated women like prey. Psychologists who later reviewed the notebooks said Thomas displayed traits of organized serial offenders, those who plan, stalk, and execute their crimes with precision. What unsettled them most, however, was how ordinary his life appeared outside the notebooks. To his neighbors, he was helpful and polite. But on paper, in his private writings, he revealed his true self, manipulative, controlling, and obsessed with power. Backhand index pointing right. If you've been following this story and it already feels like something out of a horror movie, this is real. And this is why we need to talk about it. Hit that subscribe button right now, because every time we shed light on cases like this, we honor the victims who were silenced. The motive. So why did Thomas do it? The journals provided chilling clues. Over and over again, he wrote about control. About how women had rejected him in high school, in college, and in jobs. He wrote about humiliation. About being overlooked. In one entry, he scrawled in all caps, "They think they're better than me. But when they're in my hands, I am God." Investigators realized that for Thomas, it wasn't just about killing. It was about domination. The fear. The power. And the trophies he kept, the jewelry, the shoes, the purses, were his way of reliving that power long after the crime. A pattern emerges. Cross-referencing the journals with missing persons reports, detectives identified at least 3 other women whose names appeared in his notes. All of them had vanished within a 50-mile radius of his home. None of their cases had ever been solved. One entry described a woman named Leah, who disappeared in 2006. Her case had gone cold with no leads. In Thomas's journal, he wrote, "Leah fought harder than the others. Won't forget that one." Investigators believe the remains found in his backyard likely belonged to Leah and another unidentified woman. The trial looms. As prosecutors built their case, the community wrestled with the chilling reality: they had lived next door to a serial predator. Parents who once let their kids play in Thomas's yard now shuddered at the thought. Women who remembered his stares felt sick knowing what those stares really meant. Marissa's family prepared for the upcoming trial. For them, the journals were both devastating and validating. They confirmed what they had feared for years: Marissa had been targeted. Her mother, in a tearful interview, said, "He wrote about her like she wasn't even human. Like she was just something to take. But she was my baby. She was real. And now the world will finally know the truth about him." But as horrifying as the journals were, investigators weren't done. At the bottom of the last notebook, in shaky handwriting, Thomas had scrawled one final note, almost like a confession. "They'll never find them all." This single sentence sent chills down investigators' spines. Because it suggested that even with the bodies already uncovered, there were more victims, women whose names, belongings, and remains had yet to be discovered. And suddenly, what had started as a single cold case wasn't just solved. It had become the doorway into a much larger, far more terrifying truth. Backhand index pointing right, and you'll want to hear this, because we're going to the trial. The shocking testimony. The reaction from Marissa's family. And the final, haunting reveal of just how many lives Thomas Rayburn may have destroyed. The final reckoning. By the time Thomas Rayburn was formally charged, the case had become national news. What started as the tragic disappearance of Marissa Taylor in 2008 had now been revealed as something far darker, a series of killings that spanned years, hidden in plain sight. But if people thought the arrest and the journals were the end of the story, they were wrong. The trial that followed would uncover even more horrifying truths, and leave a community forever changed. The courtroom. In the summer of 2025, Thomas Rayburn sat in a Florida courtroom wearing a plain gray suit. Gone was the helpful neighbor, the quiet man who fixed cars and waved at children. In his place sat a hollow figure, expressionless, eyes darting coldly across the room. Across from him sat Marissa's mother, clutching a photo of her daughter. Behind her were the families of other women whose belongings had been found in his home. Some had come seeking justice. Others, still searching for missing loved ones, came seeking answers. The prosecution's case was damning. They presented DNA evidence, the videotapes, the journals, and the items found buried in his backyard. Piece by piece, they painted Thomas not as a man wrongly accused, but as a predator who had stalked, abducted, and killed multiple women over nearly a decade. The defense tried to argue that the DNA was contaminated, that the journals were just fantasies, that the belongings in his home were collected from garage sales. But the evidence was overwhelming. And then came the testimony. The witness. One of the most shocking moments of the trial came when a woman, identified only as Kara for her protection, took the stand. Kara had lived in the same neighborhood as Thomas in 2009. She testified that one night, walking home from work, a man matching Thomas's description had pulled alongside her in his car, offering her a ride. When she refused, he followed her slowly until she ran into a friend's house. She never reported it at the time. But when she saw Thomas's face on the news, she knew. Her testimony sent chills through the courtroom. Because it suggested that there were women out there, like Kara, who had barely escaped becoming victims. Backhand index pointing right. Quick reminder, stories like this are why it's so important to keep cold cases alive. If you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Every time we shine light on these cases, we give families hope and keep pressure on investigators. The families speak. During the victim impact statements, Marissa's mother stood and addressed Thomas directly. Her voice shook, but her words were sharp. "For 17 years, you stole my daughter from me. You stole my sleep. You stole my peace. But you didn't steal her soul. Her light still lives, and today, justice lives too." The entire courtroom fell silent. Other families echoed her pain. Some begged Thomas to reveal where the remains of their loved ones were. Others demanded to know why. But Thomas never answered. He sat motionless, hands clasped, eyes fixed forward. The sentencing. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty. Thomas Rayburn was sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. For Marissa's family, it was justice, but not closure. Because one question remained unanswered: were there more victims? The haunting last reveal. After the trial, investigators continued combing through Thomas's journals and cross-referencing them with missing persons reports. In the final notebook, alongside the chilling words "they'll never find them all," they found a list of names. Some were crossed out. Others were not. One of the uncrossed names belonged to a woman who had disappeared from a nearby town in 2011, 3 years after Marissa. Her case had gone cold, with no leads. But now, investigators believe she may have been one of Thomas's last intended victims. The list suggested that Thomas had plans that may never be fully uncovered. And that's the most unsettling part of this entire case. Even with DNA, even with journals, even with a guilty verdict, we may never know the true number of lives he destroyed. The legacy of the case. Today, Marissa's family continues to honor her memory. They've set up a scholarship in her name, dedicated to helping young women pursue education and criminal justice, so others can fight the very kinds of monsters who took her life. Her mother says she finally sleeps at night. But sometimes, when she drives past the diner where Marissa worked her last shift, she swears she still sees her daughter smiling, waving goodbye. The community will never forget Marissa. And they will never forget that for nearly 2 decades, a predator hid among them, until persistence, science, and a refusal to give up finally brought him to justice. Backhand index pointing right. And if this story hit you the way it hit me, don't just click away, make sure you subscribe right now, because I tell stories like this, real ones, mysterious and emotional, every single time. And together, we can make sure no case, no matter how cold, is ever forgotten.